The first thing Luke Garrison noticed about the orc woman was not her tusks, not the ash gray of her skin, and not the quiet menace that most folks around Ridgeback Crossing assumed all her kind carried like a second nature. It was the way she stood at the edge of his property line in the early morning rain, perfectly still, watching his collapsed roof section with an expression that looked, of all things, like she was calculating the damage. He had been awake since before dawn, standing in his front doorway with a mug of black coffee going cold in his hand, staring at the section of his cabin roof that the weight of a week's ice and the fury of last night's storm had finally broken through. 3 thick pine beams had cracked and split, pulling half the shingles with them, and a wide, ragged hole now gaped open to the pewter sky like a wound that wasn't going to heal itself. The hay store room beneath it was exposed. If another storm rolled in, and the clouds to the northwest suggested one would, he would lose the hay that was supposed to feed his 2 horses and his small herd of goats through the rest of the winter. Losing that hay meant buying more, and buying more meant riding to Callow's mill, and Callow's mill meant dealing with Burn Hollies, who set his prices high for men who had no other option. Luke had been trying to figure out which problem to solve first, and coming up short every time he ran the numbers in his head. Then he looked up and saw her. She was standing just past the split-rail fence where his property met the wagon trail, partially hidden by the gray curtain of the rain. She was tall, easily 6 feet, with the broad-shouldered build common to orc women who had spent their lives working. Her skin was a deep, cool ash gray, and her dark hair was plastered flat against her face and neck by the rain. She wore a fitted leather bodice that laced tightly up the front over a dark charcoal linen shirt, the leather darkened further by the wet, hugging the strong lines of her figure. Below that she wore snug travel leggings of oiled deerskin, tucked into worn knee-high boots that had seen considerable mileage. A heavy travel cloak hung from her shoulders, but the wind had thrown it back so it streamed behind her like a flag, doing nothing to keep her dry. Strapped to her back was a large canvas pack, bulging and heavy-looking, and at her hip she carried a short, broad-bladed knife in a worked leather sheath. She had the lower tusks typical of her kind, curving up slightly past her lips, and her eyes, fixed on his broken roof, were a deep amber, the color of old pine sap. She was soaked through, and she was alone, and she had been standing there long enough in that cold rain that she must have been genuinely miserable, and yet she stood like a post driven into the earth, unmoving and unashamed. Luke stepped off his porch. "You lost," he called across the yard. Those amber eyes moved to him, measuring him the way she had been measuring his roof. "No," she said. Her voice was low and clear, carrying over the sound of rain hitting mud. "You looking for someone on this trail?" "No." He walked to the fence, stopping a few feet from it, close enough to talk without shouting. Up close she was even more striking, the angles of her face strong and defined, the lines around her eyes carrying the particular kind of tiredness that wasn't just physical. "You been standing out here long?" he asked. "Since before it started raining," she said. Then she seemed to decide something, and she looked back at his roof. "Your 3 main support beams are cracked through at the ridge joint. The shingles on the east half are lifting. You have maybe 2 days before the rot starts if rain gets in again." Luke blinked. "You know roofs." "I know construction," she said simply. "I built 3 longhouses for my clan before," she stopped, "before I left." There was a weight in that pause that Luke had no right to press on, not yet, maybe not ever. He looked at his broken roof. He looked at her. He was a practical man. He always had been. His father had raised him on a homestead 60 miles south of here, and had taught him that the most important thing a person could do in this world was tell the difference between a hard situation and an impossible one. A hard situation had a solution if you were willing to work. An impossible one required you to change what you were trying to achieve. Right now Luke was looking at a hard situation that was about to become an impossible one if he didn't find another pair of hands, and a woman who understood roof construction was standing 15 feet away in the pouring rain. "I've got hot coffee inside," he said, "and I could use the help if you're willing to work." She studied him for a long moment. There was no gratitude in her expression, not yet. There was wariness and calculation and a careful kind of hope that she was keeping very close to her chest where it was harder to see. "What are you offering for the work?" she asked. "Meals and shelter while the work takes," he said. "We can talk about coin after I see how bad the damage is." Another measuring silence. The rain came down between them. Then she unlatched his gate herself, swung it open and walked through. Her name, she told him over coffee that she drank standing up near the fireplace with both hands wrapped around the mug, was Rogash Ashwalker. She did not volunteer more than that for a long while, and Luke did not push. He gave her the mug, refilled his own, and went back to looking at the list of materials he was going to need. When she finally set the mug down on his rough-hewn table and moved to look at the list over his shoulder, she added 3 items he hadn't thought of and crossed out 2 he'd overcounted. "You did this before," he said. "Yes," she said, and that was all. Luke was 28 years old. He had built this homestead himself with help from his neighbor Garrett Yule over the course of 2 summers, and he had been working it alone for the past 4 years, since Garrett moved his family south after his wife took sick and needed to be closer to a real settlement. The nearest town was Ridgeback Crossing, a hard hour's ride to the east, a place of about 300 people who had mostly come to the frontier the same way Luke had, with nothing but will and tools and the stubborn belief that they could carve a life out of this land. It was not a cruel town, but it was a cautious one, and caution was often the polite word for fear, and fear was often the thing that made people do unkind things without ever quite admitting to themselves that they were doing them. Rogash was not unaware of this. He could see it in the way she positioned herself in his kitchen, always with a wall at her back, always angled toward the door. She had the quiet, constant awareness of someone who had learned the hard way that they could not afford to be caught off guard. He showed her the room off the back of the cabin, a small space that served as a storage room in warmer months, with a rope bed he hadn't used since Garrett last stayed over. He brought fresh straw for the tick and a heavy wool blanket. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a moment, and he saw something move through her face that was too quick to catch fully, something between disbelief and something much older and sadder. "This is for me?" she asked. "Unless you'd rather sleep in the barn," he said, "though the goats are opinionated company." The corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the shape of where a smile might one day lie. "The room is fine," she said. They started on the roof at first light the next morning. Luke had good timber stock in his woodpile, and Rogash moved through the selection of it with a certainty and efficiency that made him feel like a student watching a master work. She found the 3 straight pines he hadn't yet touched, ran her hands along the grain of them, checked the weight, and pointed to the 2 she wanted. She directed him to help her haul them to the side of the cabin, and then she did something he hadn't expected. She climbed. She went up the side of his cabin with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times, her boots finding purchase on the log courses, and she was on the roof before he had his belt fully buckled. From up there, she called down measurements and instructions in a calm, authoritative voice, and Luke found himself following them without the faintest urge to argue. She knew what she was doing. He knew that kind of knowing when he saw it. It was in the way her hands moved, the way she never hesitated when she made a decision, the way she caught and assessed the weight of a beam before committing her grip to it. They worked through the morning in near silence. The rhythm of it was good: pass, receive, measure, cut, set. Luke was strong and quick, and Rogash was stronger and quicker, and between them they had the cracked beams pulled free and the new ones set in place before the sun had peaked. She split shingles from the remaining timber in the afternoon with a short-handled axe that she swung with precise, economic strokes, never wasted, always exact. Luke watched her work and thought that there was something almost mathematical about the way she moved through physical labor. Every motion was deliberate, nothing burned that didn't need to burn. By dusk of the second day, the roof was sound. Luke stood in the yard and looked up at it. Then he looked at her. She was standing beside him with her arms folded, also looking up, and there was a satisfaction in her posture that she hadn't quite managed to contain. "It will hold," she said. "It will," he agreed. "Better than it was before, I think." She glanced at him sideways. "Yes, before was poor work." Luke laughed. It came out genuine and a little surprised, and he saw her react to it, a small, reflexive stiffening, like she wasn't sure what to do with his laughter being directed at her. Not at her. Not against her, just with her. She relaxed a half-second later, and he pretended not to have noticed either moment. He cooked dinner that night. Venison stew with dried beans and a half-loaf of bread he'd baked the previous week and had been saving. He set 2 bowls on the table and 2 spoons and sat down. She came to the table and sat down across from him, and they ate without talking for a while, and the fire crackled, and the wind ran around outside testing the new roof and finding nothing to work with. "The work is done," she said when the bowls were empty. "It is," he agreed. A silence fell between them, different from the comfortable working silence of the past 2 days. This one had a question in it. Luke picked up his bowl and carried it to the wash basin. He kept his back to her while he spoke because he thought it might be easier that way for both of them. "You can stay," he said. "If you need to. There's more work here than one person can manage alone, and I could use a hand through winter." He heard her chair scrape on the floor. He turned around. She was standing now, not in her usual measured, contained way, but with something raw in her posture, something that had risen up before she had time to press it back down. "You don't know me," she said. "You don't know what I am or where I've been. I know you fixed my roof better than I could have done myself," he said. "And I know you drank your coffee black and you don't take more than your share and you haven't lied to me once in 2 days. That's a better start than I've had with some of my own kind." Her jaw tightened. "People in the town will talk. People in the town always talk," he said. "I've stopped listening to most of it." She stared at him. The firelight moved across her face, catching the amber of her eyes, and Luke held himself very still because this felt like the kind of moment where the wrong movement could break something fragile. "Why?" she asked, just that. "Why?" He thought about it honestly. "Because you need somewhere," he said. "And I have somewhere. And making a person stand out in the cold when you've got a warm room that's not being used doesn't sit right with me. My father would have been ashamed of me for doing it." She stood there for a long time after that. Then she said, very quietly, "My name means something in Orcish. Ashwalker. It means one who moves through what was burned. My clan gave it to me after the raid on the Grayville camp when I was the only one who walked out of the fire." She paused. "Then they exiled me 18 months ago when I refused to burn another village." The weight of that settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. "What village?" he asked softly. "A farming settlement, 100 people. Warcaller Drog wanted to send a message to the border council. I told him I would not carry a torch into a place where there were children sleeping." Her voice was even. It was the evenness of someone who had held this in for a long time and had learned to carry it without letting it crack them open in front of people. "He exiled me, drove me out of the clan camp with nothing but the clothes on my back and the knife on my hip. I have been walking west since the last snowmelt." Luke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The farming settlement south of the Grayville Ridge, that was Fenwick Hollow." He paused. "My cousin lived there, lives there still." Rogash went very still. "You know it." "I do." He looked at her steadily. "And if you're the reason it's still standing, then you're welcome in my home for as long as you need." She sat back down. Not dramatically. Just lowered herself back into the chair as though her legs had made the decision before the rest of her caught up. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them, and Luke looked away to give her the privacy of whatever was moving through her right then. He poured 2 cups of apple cider from the jug on the shelf and set one in front of her. She picked it up and drank. They did not speak again for the rest of the evening, but when he went to bed and pulled his blanket over him and lay in the dark listening to the sound of a sound roof above him, he heard her in the next room, not crying, not pacing, just the creak of the rope bed as she settled into it, and then silence, and he thought that maybe silence could be a kind of peace when a person had been carrying noise inside them for too long. Winter set in hard that year. The Ridgeback crossing region was never gentle in the cold months. The wind came down from the northern ranges with teeth in it, and the snow fell in the kind of heavy, persistent way that changed the landscape daily. Luke kept his head down and worked his homestead, and Rogash worked beside him. She had a remarkable and varied competence. She could repair fencing in conditions that would have sent most people back indoors. She could set snares with a precision that made his look clumsy. She knew how to pack and store dry goods so they kept through deep freeze. She knew which timbers swelled with cold and needed to be checked, and which of his goats was prone to stress in weather and needed extra attention. She figured out his root cellar drainage problem in about 4 minutes of examination, and spent an afternoon in the cold fixing it while Luke worked on the shutter frames. In return, he taught her the specific temperament of this land, which rises flooded first in thaw, which sections of trail became impassable, which trees marked the old property boundary that didn't appear on any map he'd received from the territory office. He showed her the spot on the northern hill where you could see 3 valleys at once in clear weather, and she stood there for a long time without speaking, taking it in with an expression he was learning to recognize as the one she wore when something moved her, and she wasn't ready to say so aloud. The town was a different matter. He had to ride to Ridgeback Crossing for supplies about 3 weeks after Rogash arrived, and he made the mistake, or perhaps the necessary choice, of bringing her with him on the second supply run 6 weeks in because the load was too heavy for one horse and he needed her on the wagon. They came into town along the main trail, the wagon horses making a good pace, and the reaction was immediate and impossible to miss. People on the wooden boardwalk stopped walking. Conversation stopped mid-word. A woman near the dry goods store pulled her 2 young children to her side and steered them inside. A group of men outside the saloon turned to watch with the particular stillness of men who were deciding what they thought about something. Rogash sat on the wagon bench beside Luke with her back straight and her eyes forward and her face held in an expression of absolute calm. He knew by now that the calm was not indifference. He knew what the calm cost her. The dry goods merchant, a wide man named Pert Callan, came to his doorway when Luke swung down from the wagon. He looked at Rogash with undisguised suspicion. "Garrison," he said, "who's this?" "She works my homestead," Luke said, in a tone that was pleasant and completely final. "I need the usual, Pert. And a bag of oats for the goats." "She's an orc," Pert said, as though this was information Luke might have missed. "Yes," Luke said, "she is. And she fixes roofs better than any man in this county, so I'd say I came out ahead." He walked past Pert into the store, and after a moment Rogash swung down from the wagon and followed him in. Inside, a woman named Dory Hawks who ran the fabric section of the store met Rogash's eyes and did not look away with disgust as several others had. Instead, she gave a small, cautious nod, the kind that acknowledges a person rather than dismissing them. Rogash saw it. Luke, watching from the corner of his eye, saw her see it, and thought that small acts of decency were not nothing, even in a world that made them rare. The men outside the saloon were a different matter. As Luke was loading the wagon, a heavy-set man named Corin Bake, who ran a small lumber claim outside of town and had a reputation for being the kind of man who wore his opinions loud and wore them often, crossed the street and stopped by the wagon with 2 of his workers flanking him. He looked at Rogash, who was lifting a 100-pound grain sack with straightforward competence and setting it in the wagon bed. "You know there's been orc raids on the Harkin homesteads," Corin said to Luke, loudly enough that half the street could hear. "Figured you want to be careful about who you're bringing into town." "I know about the raids," Luke said calmly. He did not stop loading. "They're Bloodfang clan out of the eastern range. Rogash is not Bloodfang and she didn't raid anybody." "How do you know that?" "Because I listened to her," Luke said. He set down the last bag and turned to face Corin directly, holding the man's gaze without aggression but also without an inch of give. Same way I know things about most people. You listen to them. Corin looked at Rogash. Rogash looked back at him. She had the grain sack in both hands, and her expression was the kind of quiet that people sometimes mistook for submission, but was actually the steadiness of someone who had faced a great deal worse and was not frightened by a loud man with two friends in the middle of a muddy street. "My homestead, my business," Luke said. He climbed up to the wagon bench. "Rogash." She put the last bag in, closed the wagon's rear gate with a clean click of the iron latch, and climbed up to the bench beside him. Luke clicked the horses forward, and they rolled out of Ridgeback crossing with the town's eyes on their backs the whole way down the main trail. When they were out of sight of the buildings and moving through the pine corridor that led back toward his property, Rogash said, "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment. "People like Corin Bake do not forget," she said. "No," he agreed. "They don't. But people like that were never going to be in my corner in the first place, so I'm not losing anything." He paused. "And you're not something I need to apologize for." He could feel the weight of her looking at him from the side. He kept his eyes on the trail. After a long moment she turned back to face forward too, and the wagon rolled on through the cold, and neither of them said anything else, but something between them had shifted, had settled into a new and slightly closer configuration, like two river stones that have turned in the current until they finally find how they fit together. The worst storm of the winter came in February, and it came without much warning. Luke had been out checking the fence line on the northern pasture, when the sky changed from the flat white of a cold, clear day to the dark, bruised color that meant serious weather within the hour. He rode back hard, reached the homestead, and put his horse in the barn with the other animals. He was coming out of the barn to call for Rogash when he found that she was already across the yard, pulling the last of the wood from the outdoor stack and moving it under the eave of the barn. She was working fast, methodical, and had clearly read the weather the same way he had. "Animals are in," she called. "All in," he said, and went to help her with the wood. They got inside with about 20 minutes to spare before the storm arrived in full fury. It was a 2-day storm, the kind that shut everything down and reminded a person that nature had not consulted human or orc convenience when it made its plans. The wind was a constant roar, the snow came horizontal, and the temperature dropped to the kind that made the timbers in the walls pop and crack with the cold. They were inside together, just the two of them, for 48 hours. Luke had a reasonable collection of books, which surprised her. She had noticed them on his shelf weeks ago but had not said anything, and now with nothing to do but wait out the storm, she asked if she could look at them. He told her to take anything she wanted. She chose a surveying manual and a book of territorial geography and read them both with a focused attention that he found, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, deeply endearing. He cooked. He had jerked venison and dried beans and flour and oil and a jar of preserves he'd been saving, and he made a proper stew and a skillet of fry bread. She ate with the same quiet appetite she always brought to meals, thorough, not greedy, appreciative without being effusive. But when he put the preserves on the table and she tasted them on the bread and her eyes closed for just a second with an expression of pure, involuntary pleasure, he felt something warm move through him that had nothing to do with the fire. "Blackberry," he said, watching her. "I have not had anything sweet in a very long time," she said, and opened her eyes. He pushed the jar toward her. "Take as much as you want." She looked at the jar. She looked at him. Then she put a second generous spoonful on her bread, and he thought that might be the most he had seen her let herself have anything since she arrived, and that thought stayed with him in a way that had some ache in it. That evening, the fire burning low and the storm battering the walls outside, he asked her about her clan. Not the exile, not the raid, before all that. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer, and he was already reaching for his book to give her the cover of his attention being elsewhere, when she began to speak. She told him about growing up in the Ironstone clan, which had once been a clan of builders and traders before the war-collar politics of the past generation had turned them toward raiding and war. She had been trained from childhood in construction and foraging, had learned the old orc craft of reading landscape for resources, had apprenticed under her mother until her mother died of a lung sickness when Rogash was 16. She had been responsible for the clan's building maintenance through 3 harsh winters after that, because no one else had the skill, and she had done it without complaint, and the clan had depended on her work even while the Warcaller's warriors viewed building work as lesser than fighting. Then, 2 years ago, Warcaller Drog had taken power, and the clan's direction had turned hard and dark, and the exile at Fenwick Hollow had been the breaking point. "I do not miss the raiding," she said. "I never participated in it, but I miss the clan." She paused. "I miss having a place where I belong to something." Luke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What would belonging to something look like now if you could choose?" She looked at the fire. "Somewhere I could build," she said. "Something that lasts, something I made that doesn't get burned." He nodded slowly. He understood that. He had come to this frontier for very similar reasons, though the version of displacement he'd experienced was quieter and came with far fewer scars. The storm ended on the morning of the 3rd day, leaving a changed world outside white and blue and diamond brilliant in the returning sun. They went out together to check the animals and the outbuildings, moving through snow up to their shins, and when they reached the southern fence line and looked back at the homestead from a distance, Luke saw it the way she must be seeing it. The cabin solid against the white, smoke rising from the chimney, the new roof section clean and unbroken against the sky. "You did good work," he said, nodding at the roof. "We did," she corrected. "You did not stand around watching." He laughed. She watched him laugh, and this time she did not stiffen. She let the corner of her own mouth curl upward, and she looked back at the homestead, and in the clear winter morning light with the snow bright and the smoke rising, they stood side by side and looked at the place that was becoming, in its slow, unspoken way, something shared between them. Spring arrived the way it always did in the Ridgeback country, not gently, but in fits and starts, warm days and sudden returns of cold, mud everywhere, the land heaving and shifting as the freeze let go of it. Luke had work enough for 4 men during spring, and Rogash matched him pace for pace through all of it. They plowed the kitchen garden plot together, shoulder to shoulder, taking turns at the heaviest push of the hand plow through the still cold earth. She repaired the goat pen fencing while he mended the tack for the horses. He hauled water. She mixed the clay and fiber compound to rechink the cabin walls where the frost had opened gaps. They developed a rhythm together that was so natural and unforced that Luke sometimes caught himself in the middle of a task, pausing, realizing that he had not thought about what it meant to be here with her, had just been here, just working, just comfortable. And the realization brought a complicated warmth with it. Because it was more than comfort now, and he knew it, and he suspected she did too, and neither of them had said a word about it. The knowing was in small things, in the way she would sometimes appear beside him when he was struggling with something, without him having to ask, and her hands would join his in the work without comment, and the warmth of her presence would be so close that he could hear her breathe. In the way he would sometimes look up from the other side of the table to find her looking at him with an expression that she would quickly school into her more neutral face, but not quickly enough. In the way they had started sitting closer together in the evenings by the fire, not planned, just the slow natural drift of 2 people who wanted to be near each other and hadn't yet admitted it out loud. One evening in early spring, after a long day of tilling, he came into the cabin to find that she had cooked. Not just warmed something, she had cooked, actually cooked, a pot of spiced venison and root vegetables using seasonings he hadn't even known he had because they'd been buried at the back of the herb shelf for 3 years. The cabin smelled extraordinary. He stopped in the doorway and stared. "You have dried bracken root and saltspice that you have apparently never used," she said, without turning from the fire. It seemed wasteful. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother." A pause. She said the best construction project a person could make was a meal, because it had to be built from nothing and it disappeared the moment it was done, and that meant you had to be humble about it. He came in and closed the door. He washed his hands and sat down, and she brought the pot to the table and ladled 2 bowls, and the meal was exceptional, and he told her so with genuine enthusiasm, and she ducked her face away from the directness of the compliment in a way that he was beginning to recognize as her version of being pleased and not quite ready to receive it. "You should say thank you when someone compliments your cooking," he told her. "Thank you," she said, to the table. He smiled at his bowl. It was the evening of the brackenroot stew when Dory Hawks arrived at the homestead, her small wagon coming up the trail just as the sun was going down, and the sky was going that particular shade of deep coral and gold that the Ridgeback sunsets were known for. Luke went out to meet her, and Dory climbed down with a parcel under her arm and the expression of someone who had come to say something and was going to say it. "I heard you've had help this winter," Dory said, looking past Luke at the cabin where Rogash had appeared in the doorway. "I have," Luke said. "She fixed my roof and kept this place running through the worst of it." Dory nodded. She walked past Luke to the cabin steps where Rogash stood watching her with that careful, measured assessment. Dory held out the parcel. "I'm Dory Hawks," she said. "I run the fabric end of Callan's store in town. I brought this." She waited while Rogash, after a beat, reached out and took it. "It's a length of heavy wool, good for lining a cloak or making a proper cold season wrap. You went all winter without one by the look of you." Rogash held the parcel and looked at Dory with an expression that was very difficult to read. "Why?" she said. "Because you did a decent thing, refusing to burn that village," Dory said plainly. "My husband's brother farms the Fenwick Hollow land. He's alive because of what you did." She met Rogash's eyes steadily. "I can't speak for the whole town, and some of them will never come around, but some of us know what you are and we're grateful." Rogash stood very still. Then she said quietly, "Thank you, Dory Hawks." Dory nodded, glanced at Luke with a small, approving look and climbed back on her wagon and left. Luke went to stand beside Rogash on the step. The sunset was extraordinary, blazing out along the whole horizon, turning everything warm. Rogash was holding the parcel of wool in both hands and looking out at the sky, and whatever was moving through her, she let move through her without shutting the door on it. "Some of them know," she said. "Some of them do," he said, "and more will." She turned her head and looked at him. They were close enough on the narrow step that her shoulder was almost touching his. The light was on her face, amber and gold, catching her eyes, and he looked at her and thought she was the most remarkable person he had ever shared a roof with, and that thought came out of such a simple and genuine place in him that it was not frightening at all. It was just true. She looked at him looking at her. The moment stretched. Then she looked back at the sunset and said, "We should eat before it gets cold." "Right," he said, not moving for another second. Then he followed her inside. In April, there was trouble. Corin Bake had not forgotten, as Rogash had predicted. He had spent the winter letting his resentment simmer, and in April he rode out to the homestead with 3 other men, not to cause physical harm, but to deliver a letter from the county land administrator, a man named Forsyth who Corin had apparently been bending the ear of all winter. The letter stated that under the Border Territory Compact, non-human residents of territory homesteads were required to be registered with the county office within 90 days of taking up residence, and that failure to register was grounds for removal and potential prosecution of the homestead holder for harboring. Corin delivered this news in Luke's front yard with the satisfaction of a man who had found the lever he had been looking for. He read it loudly with his 3 companions watching as though this were a public performance. Luke took the letter. He read it himself. Then he looked up. "She's been here since early December," he said. "It's April. That's 4 months." "That's right," Corin said. "You're past your 90 days, Garrison. Administrator Forsyth says you've got 2 weeks to sort it or she goes." Rogash was standing in the doorway of the cabin. She had come out at the sound of hoofbeats, and she had heard all of it, and she was very still. "Then I'll register her," Luke said. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket. "I'll ride to the county office tomorrow." Corin looked wrong-footed. He had not expected this response. "It's not you can't just, there's a process," he said. "She'd have to be assessed, there are requirements." "Then I'll find out what the requirements are and meet them," Luke said. His voice was calm and completely immovable. "Was there something else?" Corin looked at Rogash. Rogash met his gaze and said nothing. There was a moment where the air between all of them had a charge in it, the particular tension of a situation that could break in several directions. Then Corin looked back at Luke and found nothing there to work with, and he made a sound of disgust and wheeled his horse around, and he and his 3 companions rode off. Luke waited until they were out of sight. Then he looked at Rogash. "I can leave," she said immediately. "I do not need your staying," he said. "Come inside. I need to write a list of what to bring to the county office." She looked at him for a long time. Then she came inside. The ride to the county administrative post at Calver's Ford took most of a day each way, and Luke went alone because he wanted to hear what the actual requirements were before bringing Rogash into a situation he didn't fully understand. Administrator Forsyth turned out to be a small, dry, surprisingly reasonable man who was clearly embarrassed by the instrument Corin Bake had made of him. The registration process, Forsyth explained, was genuinely simple for someone who had been lawfully residing at a homestead under the consent of the property holder, a declaration of residence, a statement of intent to contribute lawfully to the territory economy, and a fee of 2 silver marks. That was it. Luke paid the fee on the spot, signed his portion of the declaration, and brought the second half home for Rogash to sign. She looked at the document for a long time. Her name had been written into it by the administrator, and seeing it there, Rogash Ashwalker, registered resident, seemed to do something to her that she took a moment to recover from. She signed it in her careful, clear hand. Luke took it back to Calver's Ford 2 days later and filed it, and that was the end of Corin Bake's legal instrument. Luke had it on good authority from Dory Hawkes that when Corin heard the news, he was furious. Luke slept very well that night. The spring moved into summer, and summer was its own universe of work. The planting, the growing, the hauling, the repair. Luke expanded his kitchen garden with Rogash's help, and she suggested growing a section of the field crop in rotation after she had spent considerable time reading the surveying manual and the geography book, and then walking the land herself, reading the soil conditions with her hands and her knowledge. The suggestion was a good one. The harvest that autumn was the best he'd had in 4 years. But something else was happening that summer, something that did not have to do with soil or crops or roofs or county registrations. It was happening in the evenings by the fire, and in the side glances across the breakfast table, and in the way their hands sometimes met when passing something between them and lingered for just a half-second longer than the task required. It was happening in the mornings when he would go out to the well and she would already be there, and they would stand together in the early quiet before the day's noise started, drinking their coffee and watching the light come up over the eastern hills, and the silence between them was not empty at all but full to the brim of things that had not been said yet. He thought about saying them. He thought about it often. He was not a man given to avoiding things that mattered, but this mattered so much that he found himself circling it with more care than he usually brought to anything. He did not want to make a mistake with her. He did not want to say the wrong thing and have her flinch away from him, not because of what he would lose, but because of what she would lose: this place, this quiet, this first thing in her life since the exile that felt like ground under her feet. She was thinking about it too. He knew this. He could see it in the way she would sometimes look at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, in the way her hand would reach toward his and stop just short, in the way she would say his name, just his name, when calling him, and put something in the way she said it that was different from how one person calls another across a field. The moment, when it came, arrived the way the most important moments often do, not staged or planned, but sliding in sideways through an ordinary evening. They were mending the fence on the west side of the goat pasture, the work that never quite ended, the fence that always had some new complaint. It was a warm evening in July, the sun still high and golden, the air full of the smell of pine and turned earth and the distant sweetness of the wildflower meadow to the north. They were working in comfortable silence, Luke driving posts while Rogash ran the crossrail boards, and they had a good rhythm going, moving along the fence line together. He was tamping a post when he heard her make a small, sharp sound behind him. He turned. She had caught her hand on a protruding nail in one of the older boards, and a thin line of deep green-tinged blood, orc blood, was running down her palm. She was looking at it with the mild expression of someone assessing an inconvenience, not alarmed. Luke was beside her in 3 steps. "Let me see," he said. She held her hand out, which was in itself a kind of trust. She had never been particularly inclined toward being tended to. He took her hand in both of his carefully and turned it to look at the cut. It was not deep, not dangerous, but it was bleeding freely. He pulled the clean cloth from his back pocket that he always carried for sweat and dust, and he pressed it gently against her palm. She was watching him do this. He could feel her watching. He held the cloth against her hand and looked up, and they were very close, closer than they usually allowed themselves to be in unguarded moments, and he saw what was in her eyes, fully and without ambiguity, and he thought his heart might simply beat itself to pieces. "Rogash," he said, her name, just her name. "Luke," she said, just his name, just that. He lifted his free hand and touched her face. The back of his fingers against her cheek, very gentle, the kind of touch that asks a question before it offers anything. She closed her eyes. She turned her face, just the smallest fraction, into his hand, like a person who has been cold for a very long time leaning toward warmth. He kissed her. It was soft and careful, and it lasted only a moment, but it had everything in it, the whole winter, the whole spring, the whole summer of working beside her, the whole long careful approach of 2 people who had not quite been ready until they were. When he pulled back, he kept his hand against her face, and she kept her eyes closed for a moment after, and when she opened them the amber of them was very bright. "I should have said something sooner," he said. "No," she said softly. "The time was what it needed to be." She turned her head again and kissed him back, more fully this time, her uninjured hand coming up to his chest, fingers curling into the cloth of his shirt, and Luke wrapped his arm around her and held her. And the fence post he had been mid-tamping stood at a slight angle in the ground for 2 more days before either of them remembered to finish driving it in. The summer that followed that evening was different. Not in its work, the work was the same, the days the same long run of physical labor and problem-solving, but in what happened within the work, in the texture of it. They touched now. Not constantly, not showy, but in the natural way of 2 people who had crossed into a new territory together and were finding it good ground. A hand at her back when he passed her in the narrow kitchen, her shoulder against his when they sat at the table over their morning coffee. The deliberate warmth of him sitting close beside her in the evenings, her leaning into him by increments until the book in his lap and the fire before them were shared things, like everything else on this homestead was becoming shared. She laughed more. He had been waiting for that laugh, the full version of it, and when it arrived late on a warm evening, when one of the goats got into the cabin through an unlatched door and stood in the middle of the kitchen looking deeply unrepentant, it arrived like something that had always been in her and had simply been waiting for a place to come out. It was a wonderful laugh, low and genuine and whole. He told her that evening that she had a wonderful laugh. She did not duck her face away from the compliment this time. She looked at him directly, with those amber eyes full of something warm and uncomplicated, and she said, "You make it easier to have one." They were becoming each other's home, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was frightened by it anymore. In late August, a party of riders came to the homestead from the east. 5 of them, hard-faced men with the look of clan-affiliated mercenary work about them, wearing mixed armor and carrying themselves with the particular swagger of men who were paid to be intimidating. They pulled up in Luke's yard, and the one at the front, a broad, dark-haired man with a warcollar's braid half grown out, called toward the cabin. "Ashwalker," he called. "Warcaller Drog sends word. Come out." Luke was already at the door of the cabin, his rifle in his hands, not aimed, held across his body in the way that communicated readiness without aggression. He had heard the hoofbeats and had moved fast. Rogash was behind him, and he felt her hand briefly touch his shoulder as she stepped around him to stand beside him, not behind. "I know you," Rogash said to the braid-haired man. She said it without emotion. "Keth, you were at Grayville. Warcaller wants you back," Keth said. He did not acknowledge Luke's rifle except with a flicker of his eyes. "Not as exile. He's willing to rescind it if you return and take your work back. The clan's winter structures are failing without you." "So he needs my hands," Rogash said. "He's offering to rescind, he needs my hands," she said again, not a question. She stood with her arms at her sides, her knife on her hip, exactly as she had stood in Luke's yard in the rain on the morning she arrived, and she had not changed in her posture or her bearing, but she was not the same person who had stood there, and they both knew it. "Tell the warcaller that I am not property to be recalled when I become useful. Tell him I am not coming back." "He will not be pleased," Keth said. "He was not pleased when I told him I would not burn a village of children," Rogash said. "I have learned to continue existing through his displeasure." Luke had not moved. He was standing beside her, the rifle easy in his hands, his eyes on the 5 riders one at a time, calm and steady. He had grown up on this frontier. He knew that men like this read the terrain of a person's resolve the way a hunter reads a trail, and what they were reading in him right now was that there was no give here, none at all. This was not bravado. It was just the truth of where he stood. Keth looked at Luke for a long, measuring moment. Then he looked at Rogash. Then he turned his horse and rode back east, and his 4 companions turned and followed him, and the dust of them settled on the trail and was gone. Rogash turned and walked back into the cabin. Luke lowered the rifle and followed her. She was standing at the table with her hands flat on it, head down, the aftermath of something running through her. "He will not come back," she said. "When I left the clan, I took the knowledge with me. He can find no other builder. He needs me, which means he cannot move against me openly without losing the one thing he sent for." "He might find another way," Luke said carefully. "He might," she agreed. She lifted her head and looked at Luke. Her expression was complex relief and grief and anger and something resolute at the center of it. "I am not going back," she said. "Whatever else happens, this is where I am." "Yes," he said. He crossed the cabin and stood close to her, and she turned to face him, and he put both hands on her face, careful and certain, and looked at her. "Yes," he said again. "This is where you are." She pressed her forehead to his. They stood like that for a long moment, and the cabin was quiet, and outside the homestead went about being the homestead, the goats in their pen, the horses in the barn, the garden growing in the sun, the roof that she had fixed holding its ground against the sky. The nights had been warm all summer, the summer heat staying in the walls of the cabin long after the sun went down, and Rogash had been sleeping in the back room the entire time, the room that was hers, that had been hers since December. After the evening with the riders, Luke found himself unable to sleep, and he sat at the table with a cup of water in the dark, and he was still there when the door to her room opened and she came out. She saw him and stopped. "You could not sleep either," she said. "No," he said. She came and sat across from him, and they sat in the dark for a while. The cabin was warm and quiet. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and left it there. After a while he turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that until the night went from black to the deep blue that came before the first light, and then she came around the table and he rose, and they were very close, and she lifted her face and he bent his head and kissed her slowly in the dark kitchen, and it was different from the fence-line kiss in the warmth and urgency and depth of it, and when they pulled apart she looked at him with her amber eyes wide open and honest and unguarded. "Luke," she said quietly. "I know," he said. She took his hand and led him to her room, and he followed, and the door closed, and the night outside was full of stars and the warm breathing of the land, and what happened between them was tender and deliberate, and had the particular beauty of two people who have spent a long time learning each other before this, who know the weight and warmth of the person beside them, who understand that intimacy at its best is not a single moment, but the accumulation of every honest and careful moment that came before. It was warmth in the darkness and closeness without reservation, and afterward she lay with her head on his chest and his arm around her and the sound of his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, and she thought, for the first time in 18 months, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He pressed his lips to the top of her head and held her. In the morning they were still there, and the world outside was still the same world, the goats, the horses, the garden, the roof, and none of it had changed and all of it had changed, and both of them knew the difference. The autumn of that year was golden and full. The harvest came in well, as she had predicted with her soil assessments and the rotation she had suggested, and Luke hauled it to Ridgeback Crossing in 3 trips, Rogash beside him on the wagon bench each time. The town had not come entirely around. There were still those who looked away or crossed the street when they came through, still those who would not meet her eyes or speak to her directly. But Dory Hawkes was reliably warm. The farrier, an older man named Sable Thorn, had taken to greeting her by name and with a genuine nod. And the blacksmith, who went by the single name Hawk and didn't make conversation with anyone as a rule, had let her watch him work one afternoon when she came in with a bent iron tool from the homestead that needed reshaping, and had then handed her the hammer and let her correct the bend herself, which she did cleanly and efficiently, and had given her the grunt that served as his highest compliment. She was not part of the town, not yet. But she was a presence in it that was beginning to have dimensions beyond simply being the orc at Luke Garrison's homestead, and that was a start. One afternoon in late September, Dory brought her a visitor. He was a young man, barely past 20, human, with the frightened and road-worn look of someone who had been moving hard for days. He was from Fenwick Hollow. His name was Calden, and he was Luke's cousin. Luke had sent word to his cousin in the spring, a brief letter explaining that the woman who had refused the torch at Fenwick Hollow was living and working on his homestead. Calden had apparently been composing a response ever since, and had apparently decided at some point that a letter wasn't sufficient. He stood in Luke's yard, hat in his hands, looking at Rogash with the expression of a man who has thought about something for months and now doesn't quite know what to do with himself. Rogash stood on the porch step and looked back at him. "I wanted to thank you," Calden said. "My mother was there, my 2 sisters, my neighbors, all the children in the schoolroom." His voice broke slightly. He pressed on. "I know you lost everything for it. I needed you to know that we know." Rogash was very still. Then she came down the porch steps and crossed the yard and stood in front of this young man, and she held out her hand, the strong, work-calloused hand of a builder who had spent her life making things that lasted. He shook it, gripping hard, his eyes bright. "Tell them they are welcome in their homes," she said. "Tell them the choice was easy." It was only the cost that was hard. Calden stayed for dinner. He and Luke talked through most of the evening, catching up on family and territory news, and Rogash sat at the table and ate and listened and occasionally said something, and Calden spoke to her like a person directly, without the flinching hesitation that most newcomers brought. Before he left in the morning, he shook Luke's hand and then turned to Rogash and said, "If there is ever anything Fenwick Hollow can do for you, come to us." She thanked him. He rode east. Luke stood in the yard and watched him go, and then he felt Rogash's hand find his and he held it. The winter of their 2nd year together was nothing like the first winter. The first winter had been 2 strangers sharing space out of necessity and mutual benefit, careful and watchful and careful again. This winter was entirely different. This winter was 2 people who knew each other deeply, who had held each other in the dark and worked beside each other in the cold, and trusted each other with the parts of themselves that were not easy to show. And they moved through the days of that winter with an ease and contentment that Luke had not known was possible. She had arranged the back room fully now, brought small things into it that made it fully hers: a carved wooden box she had made herself for her few personal items, a length of dory's wool draped along the bed, a sketch she had made in charcoal of the view from the northern hill, the three-valley view he had shown her that first winter. But she did not always sleep there. Sometimes she slept with him, and sometimes he with her, and the arrangement was natural and unforced and full of warmth. He asked her to marry him in January. He had not planned a grand gesture. He had simply been sitting with her at breakfast, snow falling outside, the fire going, the smell of coffee and the bread she had baked the night before still in the air, and he had looked at her over his mug and thought that this was the life he wanted and she was the person he wanted it with, and the only question that remained was whether she wanted the same, and the only way to find that out was to ask it. "Rogash," he said. She looked up from the geography book. She had started reading through all his books a second time and had opinions about all of them. "Will you marry me?" he said, just like that. She looked at him for a long time. The snow fell outside. The fire crackled. One of the goats made a noise in the barn, muffled and distant. "The town will have things to say about it," she said. "I know," he said. "Some people will never accept it." "I know," he said again. "I don't need them to accept it. I need you to want it." She set the book down very carefully, as though she was managing the situation by managing the objects in it. Then she said, "In my clan, a bonding is called a word that means, roughly, the settling of two rivers into one." She paused. "I have thought about it since summer. I have thought about what it would mean, whether it was something I could permit myself to want." She looked at him with the amber eyes that he knew now as well as he knew his own hands. "Yes," she said. "I want it. Yes." He came around the table and she stood, and he held her face in his hands and she gripped the front of his shirt, and they stood together in the morning kitchen with the snow coming down outside, and it was one of the finest moments of his life, and he was not too proud to say so. The ceremony was held in May, when the land was green, and the wildflower meadow to the north was in full bloom. They did it at the homestead rather than in the town, because the homestead was theirs and it was the right place, and because Luke wanted Rogash to be able to stand on her own ground when they made this promise to each other. Dory Halks came and brought her husband, a quiet, steady man who shook Luke's hand and told him he was doing a good thing. Sable Thorn the farrier came. Hawk the blacksmith came, looking deeply uncomfortable in his clean shirt and refusing to make conversation with anyone but present. Calden came from Fenwick Hollow with his mother and his two sisters, and his mother embraced Rogash with an intensity that made Rogash stand very still for a moment before slowly, carefully, wrapping her arms around the smaller woman in return. The vows were short. Luke had written his, and Rogash had written hers, and they spoke them to each other in the wildflower meadow with the afternoon sun warm on them, and the wind moving through the grasses, and a small group of people standing as witnesses. Luke told her she had come to his homestead in the rain and fixed what was broken, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life doing the same for her in whatever way she needed. Rogash told him that she had spent her life building things for others that she never got to keep, and that she intended this to be the building she kept. Hawk, who had brought a gift of an iron bracket fashioned in the interlocking ring pattern that was, he said gruffly, an old symbol for bonded partnership, looked at the ground when the vows were being said and appeared to be fighting something in his chest, and no one commented on it. They had a feast in the homestead yard, potluck from everyone who came, and there was apple cider and good bread and smoked venison and Dory's extraordinary honey cake. And Rogash ate the honey cake with her eyes closed briefly, and with an expression of pure and uncomplicated pleasure that Luke was going to remember for the rest of his life. After the guests had gone and the yard was quiet and the evening had come down soft and golden, they sat on the porch together, her leaning into his side, his arm around her, looking out at the land that was theirs. "Luke Garrison," she said. "Rogash Garrison," he said. "If you want it," she considered. "Rogash Ashwalker Garrison," she said. "I keep both." "Good," he said. "Both fit you." She tilted her head and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and they were deeply, fully, completely in love, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say it in this moment because it was present in every atom of the evening around them. He kissed her forehead. She settled further into his side. The first stars came out. 2 years after the wedding, their son was born. He came into the world in the late spring, early enough in the season that the air was still cool at night, and the cabin held a comfortable warmth. He was large for a newborn orc human children tended to be, with his father's dark hair and his mother's amber eyes, and the faint ash-gray tint to his skin that would either deepen or lighten as he grew. He was loud and decisive about his opinions from the first hours, which struck both of them as characteristic. They named him Aldrich Garrison. And Rogash, lying in their bed with this new and extraordinary person on her chest, and Luke sitting on the edge of the bed beside her with his hand covering both of them, looked at her son and then at her husband and said quietly, "We made something that lasts." Luke leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers. "We did," he said. Aldrich made his presence known in the cabin from that point forward, with the kind of commitment that left no doubt about his intentions. He was curious and physical, and had, apparently, inherited both his mother's practical competence and his father's stubbornness, which meant he was very capable of getting himself into difficult situations and very unwilling to be extracted from them by anyone who wasn't on his personal approved list. He was walking by the time other children his age were still finding their feet, and talking not long after that, and his first clearly purposeful word was not Mama or Papa but Roof, because he had apparently been watching Rogash check the annual condition of the cabin's roof lines, and had decided this was important. Rogash received this honor with the dignified satisfaction it deserved. Ridgeback Crossing did not become a place of perfect acceptance. That would have been a false accounting. There were still those who looked askance, still those who would not trade with Rogash directly, still those who made their children cross the street. But there were also more of those who had come around. The harvest that Luke and Rogash ran together for 4 consecutive years, the quality of which was the talk of the county markets, did a great deal to make the case that competence was not bounded by species. Rogash began, quietly, to offer construction assessments to neighbors whose outbuildings were failing or whose homesteads needed expertise. Most of them came to her because they needed the help and could not afford to be particular about it. And some of them came away from the experience with the uncomfortable realization that the person they'd feared was the most capable builder they had ever met. By the time Aldrich was 5, 3 families in the surrounding homesteads had had Rogash on their roofs or in their barns or assessing their root cellar drainage. And these were families who had children the same age as Aldrich. And children are not born with prejudice. They acquire it, and the acquiring takes time. And the children of Ridgeback Crossing grew up knowing Aldrich Garrison, who had his mother's amber eyes and his father's jokes, and could outrun every child his age and was generous with his toys and interesting at lessons. The world did not change all at once, but it changed. Hawk the blacksmith took Aldrich on as an informal apprentice when the boy was 7, teaching him metalwork with the same gruff methodology he applied to everything. And the sight of an ash-gray child hammering iron in the blacksmith's forge became a normal feature of Ridgeback Crossing in a way that was small and particular, and in the accumulation of small and particular things, meaningful. On Aldrich's 8th birthday, Rogash told Luke she was carrying their second child. She told him in the evening as they sat on the porch, the same porch where they had sat on their wedding day's evening, and she said it simply and watched him, and what she saw in his face was everything she needed to see, the pure, unguarded joy of a man who had everything he wanted and knew it. He took her hand and held it. "Boy or girl," he said, "I want them to know what you gave up to protect those people." "I gave up a place I no longer belonged," she said. "I found a place I did." She squeezed his hand. "That is not sacrifice, that is very good luck." Their second child was a daughter. They named her Sira, and she had her father's dark hair and her mother's tusks, small and perfect, and she had from her first hour a quality of stubborn affection that made herself the center of whatever room she was in without apparent effort. Aldrich, who had been anxiously awaiting her arrival, took one look at her and declared she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and maintained this position without reservation for the rest of his life. The homestead expanded over the years. A larger barn, with an efficient new drainage system that Rogash designed from first principles, a second garden plot, a separate workshop building where Rogash did her construction planning work, because by the time Sira was 4, people from 3 counties over were coming to the Garrison homestead to consult with the orc builder about their failing structures and difficult terrain challenges, and Luke had built her a proper space for the work because she deserved one. He had also, in the spring following Sira's birth, filed with the Territory Land Office to add Rogash's name to the homestead deed. It had required a letter from Administrator Forsyth, who was by this point significantly more experienced with the Garrison file, and a filing fee and a brief wait. When the new deed came back with both their names on it, Luke Garrison and Rogash Ashwalker Garrison, joint holders of the Garrison homestead, Ridgeback territory, he had brought it to her in the workshop where she was drafting a plan for a neighbor's new barn. She had looked at the deed for a long time. He had watched her read her own name on it, watched her trace the letters with one fingertip. Then she had carefully folded it and set it on the corner of her drafting table where she would see it every day, and she had looked at him with the amber eyes that had measured his broken roof on a cold morning several years ago and had never, not once in all that time, looked at him with anything less than complete honesty. "Thank you," she said. "Our home," he said. She came to him across the workshop and held him, and he held her back. And outside the windows of the workshop, their children were playing in the yard, Aldrich and Sira, and 2 of the neighbor children who had come over, all of them running in the grass in the late afternoon light, half-orc and fully human, and entirely unconcerned with the difference. And their voices were clear and loud and full of the ordinary, extraordinary joy of children who have been well loved and do not doubt it. The years settled into the land around them the way all good years do, not with drama or great events, but with the accumulation of mornings and harvests and seasons and meals and conversations, and the particular warmth of sleeping beside the person you love and knowing that tomorrow will bring more of the same good life. Luke grew gray at his temples by the time he was 40, which Rogash found distinguished, and she told him so, which he found delightful. She developed a small network of laugh lines around her amber eyes from the exercise of a happiness she had once thought inaccessible to her, and they were the most beautiful lines he had ever seen on any face. There came an evening, in the late autumn of what would have been their 15th year together on the homestead, when they sat on the porch in the cooling air and watched the sun go down over the western hills. Aldrich was inside cooking, having decided at some point in his adolescence that he was going to be the one who cooked in this house, and had pursued this ambition with his characteristic focused determination. Sira was sitting on the porch rail drawing in her sketchbook, the one she had filled 3 times over with the detailed architectural sketches that she had been producing since she was 9, looking more and more like the person who would eventually carry on her mother's building work. The smell of Aldrich's cooking came through the open door. Luke had his arm around Rogash. She was leaning into him. She had over 15 years become so thoroughly at home against his side that the shape of her there felt like a necessary part of him. "We did well," he said quietly. She looked out at the western light. "Yes," she said, "we did. You fixed my roof," he said. She glanced up at him with the amber eyes and the laugh lines and the warm familiar glow of a love that had only deepened across every year of being lived. "You gave me somewhere to fix it," she said. He kissed her temple. She settled further into him. Sira made a small noise of contentment and turned a page in her sketchbook. From inside, Aldrich called that dinner was ready, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a young man who had something worthwhile to offer the people he loved. The 4 of them gathered at the table, the same table where two strangers had first drunk coffee together on a cold morning years ago. The same table where Rogash had signed a declaration of residence with careful, clear letters, where they had planned planting seasons and read books and argued warmly about geography and eaten countless meals that started as necessity and became, over time, the texture of their shared life. The food was good. The fire was warm. The roof above them was sound. It had held that roof. It had held through every winter and every storm and every difficulty the years had brought, just as she had promised it would when she was still a stranger standing in the rain at the edge of his fence, looking at his broken homestead with eyes that knew how to see what needed fixing and hands that knew how to do the fixing, and the particular, unbreakable strength of a person who had refused to burn the world down, even when the world had done its considerable best to burn her. She had walked through the ash and arrived at his gate, and he had offered her coffee and a job and a room, and she had fixed his roof. And then, in the way that the best things happen, not all at once but slowly, surely, with the patience of people who understand that good things are built the same way good structures are built, foundation first, beam by beam, joint by careful joint, she had stayed. And it had turned out to be the most important structure either of them had ever built.